Yeah, Bev, indeed they did play a significant part, but it also played a significant role in her staying in Israel and having freedom here in Israel for more than a decade. Malka Leifer was born in Israel in Tel Aviv, and she'd been living in Australia when in 2008 there were allegations that were raised by students at that school. Malka Leifer fled to Israel and was held here in relative freedom for more than a decade while there was a legal tussle around her extradition. Eventually, in 2021, it went to the High Court, and it was resolved that Malka Leifer did have to return to Australia to face trial for these allegations that she's now being found guilty of. And the consequences of that are still being felt here in Jerusalem and in Israel. There's been a lot of commentary today about Israel's role in the extradition process, whether or not there were delays and necessary delays in the extradition of Malka Leifer back to Australia. In fact, there was a former health minister here who was actually convicted for obstructing justice and pressuring ministry employees to alter psychiatric evaluations for Malka Leifer to say that Malka Leifer wasn't actually fit to stand trial as a reason for her to stay here in Israel. That health minister was convicted and sent to jail. So a lot of talk today about the role that Israel has played in this, whether or not there needs to be some sort of further examination of why Malka Leifer was allowed to stay here in Israel in relative freedom for more than a decade and not be returned to Australia for trial for those years.
An interesting point, as you say, and interesting to hear that there is that perspective and reflection on that. Allyson, let's come back to the weekend. More protests over the planned judicial reforms. Is there still concern that there is any real commitment to a proper negotiation over these reforms?
I think a lot of the people who have been protesting would say no, that they are not hopeful, and that's why they're still protesting on the streets. As you mentioned, this freeze has been placed on these judicial reforms, which would effectively include giving the government power over judicial appointments and also giving the government the power to overturn Supreme Court decisions. Big changes to the judicial system in Israel, and which we've seen for months now. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have been coming out to protest against just because those judicial changes are now put on hold while negotiations are taking place doesn't mean that those protesters feel confident that there will be any real negotiations or any real progress. It's because up until this point there has been ongoing talk of negotiations and changes and amendments being made. Those discussions have been absolutely fruitless, and Benjamin Netanyahu, as we've seen, has been under increasing pressure, not just from here, but also from abroad, from people in very high positions of power in the international community to amend this legislation. And so now the Knesset is in its winter break. It has gone for a break for about a month now to give some time for these negotiations to take place. The Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, has been leading these negotiations with members of the opposition and the Justice Minister. Importantly, at this point, Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't actually been involved in those discussions, as we understand. But the people who are protesting say that they will continue to protest. They feel that they have come this far, and to keep the pressure on, this is what they need to keep doing. So I don't think we're going to see any reduction in the protests. Certainly all of the different groups that we have spoken to say they still feel, in their words, that their democracy is under threat.
Yeah. Interestingly, though, Benjamin Netanyahu has just in the last few minutes said he'll delay the dismissal of his defence minister, who was very critical of the reforms and sort of triggered that wave of extraordinary protests at the start of last week.
Yes, this is a man by the name of Yoav Gallant. He is the Defence Minister who last week quite controversially spoke out against these judicial reforms. He was the first senior member of the Netanyahu coalition to speak out against these reforms and the risks that pushing this overhaul through may pose to Israel's security. At that time, Benjamin Netanyahu issued him with a verbal directive, effectively firing him. But what we have seen since then is that Yoav Gallant has still been conducting the operations of the Defence Minister. So on paper, he is still the Defence Minister. And what we've just heard in the last couple of minutes, Bev, is that Benjamin Netanyahu is reconsidering the position of Yoav Gallant and whether or not his verbal termination will become a formal termination. What we're hearing from the Prime Minister's office is that Benjamin Netanyahu is considering the heightened security situation around this part of the world at the moment, particularly around the West Bank. We know it's been the last 12 months have been some of the most deadly and bloody that witnessed around the West Bank and also in Jerusalem and Israel for several years now. So it's an incredibly tense situation here. And what we hear from the Prime Minister's office is that this is the sort of background that Benjamin Netanyahu is considering now in effectively putting a pause on that verbal termination that he gave Defence Minister. But I think, Bev, what it really signifies is how this situation around these judicial reforms, this judicial overhaul, is continuing to unfold, and Benjamin Netanyahu is certainly feeling the pressure.
Yeah. Allyson, appreciate that update. Thank you so much.